It's a very good Sunday afternoon. My name is Stanley. I am a Zimbabwean. Today, I want to talk about the events or the situation in South Africa. There's been a number of protests that have been taking place ever since the beginning of the year against migrants who have been living in South Africa. It's a very difficult moment, not just for South Africa, not just for the affected migrants, but I think for the entire African continent. We know migration is becoming an international issue, but we have seen just how it has become a flashpoint in South Africa over the last decade or so. Since the beginning of this year, it looks like the problem is coming to a head in South Africa. There has been 3 groups, organized groups of South Africans, which has been marching against migrants, calling for their removal from the country. But before we talk about the events of the last few months, it's important to foreground the current situation and what is happening in South Africa now. It's not something new. This is something that has been going on for a number of years. Prior to independence in 1994, South Africa had a perimeter wall which was built right across the country's very long border lines. South Africa has a borderline that is 4,000 kilometers long, or thereabout, 4,000 or just above 4,000 kilometers long, with Mozambique, with Namibia, with Zimbabwe, and Botswana. It is a very, very long borderline which is difficult to police. But during the apartheid system, a perimeter wall had been built mainly to keep the guerrilla movements from Zimbabwe and Mozambique in particular, to conduct raids and excursions into South Africa to attack the apartheid forces as an act of solidarity with the ANC. Now, in 1994, the South African President Nelson Mandela introduced a policy of Ubuntu and opened up South Africa to other Africans to come to South Africa and help build an independent South Africa. But prior to that, prior to independence in 1994, the apartheid system in South Africa had also recruited other Africans, particularly from Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Lesotho, Swaziland, to come and work in mines in South Africa. So the issue of migration is something that has been with South Africa for a long time, pre and post-independence. And of course, after independence, Nelson Mandela introduced an open door policy for Africans to come and help South Africa build its economy after the end of apartheid, and also to assist in helping upskill the black population which had lived under apartheid system, which did not or suppressed the educational opportunities of black South Africans. But fast forward to 2008, when we saw the first substantive xenophobic attacks that were suffered by foreign nationals in South Africa. At the time, Thabo Mbeki was the president. You remember the famous or infamous pictures on Reuters, AFP, AP of a Mozambican man being burnt alive with a tire hung around his neck, what they call necklacing in South Africa. The images shocked the world. It shocked the continent, but did not do much to leave us with lessons or to bring some kind of agency in dealing with the issue of the tensions around migration in South Africa. I remember, I'm from Zimbabwe, and I remember at that particular time, there was a political implosion, an economic implosion in Zimbabwe. And there was also an international economic implosion. You remember the 2008 banking crisis, which affected the global economy. And at that time, this global crisis collapsed some of the economic indicators in South Africa, which led to the scapegoating of migrants. To make matters worse, the crisis that was happening in Zimbabwe, the political crisis, it was the first time Zimbabwe had an election, and it was the first time that the opposition had managed to beat the ruling ZANU-PF party, then led by the late President Robert Mugabe. This led to the attack of intellectuals, civil servants, particularly those who were working in rural areas, nurses, teachers, extension officers, because they were accused of poisoning the local communities into voting the opposition. This led to droves of Zimbabweans to run away from the country, cross into South Africa illegally in search of safety. The numbers were so huge that the South African government could not cope. So a decision was made to welcome the Zimbabweans who were coming into South Africa, with or without papers. And I remember in 2008, I managed to visit the border town of Musina, where we witnessed South Africans exhibiting the spirit of Ubuntu, welcoming Zimbabweans, sheltering them, giving them clothes, food, medical facilities. It was a spectacle to behold. As difficult as it was, the South African government did what they could with the little resources that they had to look after Zimbabweans. And this decision then morphed into the temporary work permits that Zimbabweans later got from the South African government, because surely the problem was just too overwhelming that they also didn't know what to do with the huge numbers of Zimbabweans who were escaping the crisis at home. So a decision was made for them to be assimilated and perhaps be allowed to work and contribute to the South African economy. Then we saw yet another round of xenophobic violence. In 2015, I happened to be working for the BBC World Service News at that time, and I was dispatched from London to Durban. We flew into Durban with my team, went straight to a stadium in a place called Chatsworth. There, the then Minister of Social Welfare, Bartabile Dlamini, was visiting the stadium to assess the situation of the migrants who had then fled their homes and went to this stadium in Chatsworth in search of safety. So to enter the stadium, you had to identify yourself, produce a document. I produced my Zimbabwean passport, and all hell broke loose. The minister's team would not have me inside. And to be honest, at that particular point, I felt like it was a classical example of xenophobia. I was not an illegal migrant. I was in South Africa on professional duty, but simply because I was a Zimbabwean, they denied me entry into the stadium until, of course, the minister intervened, and I was allowed to get into the stadium and did my work, including interviewing the minister. But what I saw there has stayed with me. I just couldn't believe just how humanity had evaporated in that particular point. I saw, men and women and children living in very squalid conditions, sleeping in the open, with no adequate sanitary facilities. It was really, really a very bad situation. I later on went to Port Elizabeth, where there was a different kind of story. There weren't so many reports of xenophobic violence in Port Elizabeth. In actual fact, the story that we went to do was of one particular community in an informal settlement which had taken the decision to protect migrants who were living in their community. We did a broadcast from one of the spaza shops, or the sort of community shops or informal shops, informal supermarkets for the international audience. And it was owned by a Somali guy, and everyone in this community had nothing but kind words for this man. They praised him for being always present in assisting the community, whether there is a funeral or there is a medical emergency. He would use his car to take someone to the hospital, to help women who would go into labor. He had become one of theirs. That's how he was described. So this spaza shop was guarded during that time, 24 hours a day, by young people in the area. And we also had the privilege to attend a community meeting at a local school. And ironically, this school, the headmaster at this school was a Zimbabwean. And he got a lot of praise from the community for how he had navigated the educational crisis in the community and persuaded young people in the area to pursue education, and helped some of them who came forward with testimonies of just how he had managed to help them to get into education and navigate their way out of poverty. So it was really an interesting story. And I'm saying this story because it's very important to put this crisis, the current crisis, in a context. And I'm invoking my experience as a journalist because it's very, very important, because I want to talk about the role that the South African media has also played in this crisis. We have seen the foregrounding of migrants in news reportage as criminals. The acquitting of someone who perhaps doesn't have papers, or someone who came to South Africa illegally, as a criminal. A criminal that is being seen in the same light as someone who sells drugs, or someone who goes about committing rape and murdering people. I just feel the way this story has been narrated in the South African media, it's like all the migrants, whether they have committed crime or not, they're coming into this story as criminals. And the three groups who are driving these protests against migrants, the March, and the other two, which are led by the actor and the former radio presenter, they are now being, you hear sometimes these groups being referred to as marchers. Then on another news report, you hear them being referred to as civic society, as bona fide civic society who are doing a great act on behalf of South Africa. In as much, it's not for me to judge whether they have it is their responsibility to carry the voice of South Africans or not, but I just feel like the way they have been represented in the media, it's as if they are the messiah that the country has been waiting for to solve this migration crisis. I would give an example. AfriForum, the group of pro, or the Afrikaner pressure group, which uses litigation law, which uses also public representation to further the interest of Afrikaners. Oftentimes it would be referred to as the Afrikaner group, AfriForum. Then at one time it was referred to as the civic society. And it just depends with the narrative that the media would want to push at a particular point. When AfriForum sided with Donald Trump, when he said there was a genocide taking place in South Africa, we saw the South African media changing tune, now calling them the fringe Afrikaner group. So I just feel like the South African media, on issues that matter and issues of national significance, as these xenophobic attacks and the international affairs, such as the Donald Trump affair, when it comes to those serious issues, they have not painted themselves in glory. It's really unfortunate, but it's something that I thought I would highlight as part of contextualizing this problem, just the role that the South African media has played in scapegoating migrants and, presenting them as a legitimate subject of attack. It's something that needs to be addressed, and it's something that newsrooms in South Africa should really look at more seriously to avoid causing further harm to migrants. To flee one's country and go to South Africa in search of safety is not a crime. It's not a crime. Even if it was a crime, there are ways. The other important issue to raise, all this is also happening in an election, a very crucial election year, in which the ANC is expected to lose its political stranglehold on the country's local government authorities. Now, it will obviously be convenient for the ANC to ignore what is happening in the country, because they would want the country to be focused on the attacks. Let me put it this way. They would want the country to focus on migration as the one and only issue that is causing all the other problems in South Africa, from unemployment, deteriorating infrastructure, crime, rape, all the gender-based violence, all the ills of the South African society. I'm sure at this particular moment, they would rather the country think it is all down to migrants, because they don't have a story to sell ahead of the elections that are coming in November. And this explains why the South African government has been lethargic in addressing this xenophobic violence ever since it started at the beginning of the year. Because how else can you justify the silence of the South African government? The marauding crowds who have been walking around and running around the streets of South Africa, stopping everyone they suspect to be a migrant, should have been stopped. That's why there are arms of the state that are mandated with maintaining law and order in South Africa. The police, the provincial police, and the border management authorities, they have that responsibility to do this, that these groups which have decided to take the law into their own hands are doing. And I don't blame the March and the other groups, but it's very, very important. I'll come to the role of the South African government in this, but I just want to address this point and make it clear that not all South Africans are xenophobic. but the country has a problem of xenophobia. It's something that I personally witnessed. It's something that my friends who are South African, my friends who are not South African, they accept. The scapegoating of migrants is not just a problem in South Africa. We have seen it in the United States. We have seen it all across Europe. It's everywhere where there's a problem. But the issue is, in South Africa, unlike in Europe and in America, the migrant is black. And often they're scapegoated by whites. But in this particular situation, we are seeing a very peculiar dimension, a dimension of African to African xenophobia. And I'm saying this because the context of South Africa is really interesting, because there are white migrants in South Africa. And they are not getting the same treatment that the blacks are getting. And I'm not saying this to try and equalize, but it's just an observation which is very important to make, because it's part and parcel of the story and the analysis of what is happening in South Africa at this particular moment. This is really important, because I will explain a little bit later why this is important to mention and why this is important to pay attention. Often things like these do not happen in a vacuum. Things like this often happen because it has sponsors behind. Ladies and gentlemen, what is happening in South Africa is very sad. But we saw it again in 2021. I will not belabor the point. Obviously, in 2015? Forgive me for if my statistics are wrong here, but 62 people died. Then in 2021, I think about 300 people died. Then we don't have like updated figures for 2026, but we've had a number of incidences which led to the deaths of migrants. Now, on Tuesday, 30th of June, a deadline has been issued by which all migrants should have left South Africa. This is the only news story in South Africa right now. One, because it's convenient for the ANC government. Two, it's because it's also convenient for the other parties who are complicit to this problem, the business sector, who have benefited immensely from these tensions. I'll explain briefly why I'm saying this. As we speak, South Africa is in the throes of a semi-criminal trial of the president. There is an impending discussion over whether to impeach the president for something that is called the Phala scandal, in which the president of South Africa was found with hordes of United States dollars under a sofa at his farmhouse. The members of parliament are pushing for inquiry to understand how the president ended up having, American dollars, a huge amount of American dollars at his farmhouse. We are also having another inquiry looking into the involvement of police officers and other senior government officials in criminal activities in South Africa. It's called the Madlanga Commission, which led to the suspension of the then Minister of Police. It has also led to the spotlighting and suspension of various police commissioners and other senior government officials. It's corruption in South Africa, high-profile corruption in South Africa on display. These are some of the important stories that are happening now. So this xenophobic story is perhaps one that all of them would rather be spotlighted than the other important stories that are happening and consequential stories that are happening in South Africa. So these things are not happening in a vacuum, and it explains why the South African government had somehow turned a blind eye to these issues. It recently came to the attention of international media and other governments when 300 Ghanaians asked their government to repatriate them back to Ghana after they were attacked in their homes in South Africa. Now, let me make it clear. South Africans have got a right to ask for their government to end acts of criminality that have been taking place in South Africa. But what is wrong is to equate or to ascribe all the ills of crime in South Africa on migrants. I'm not denying the fact that there are some migrants who are involved in criminal activity. In 2010, during the World Cup in South Africa, I was robbed 3 times in one day. And the people who robbed me were not South Africans, they were Zimbabweans. So I understand where South Africans are coming from. But it would be very simplistic to ascribe everything that is wrong in South Africa to migrants. So the South African government can do better by, number one, cleaning up, tightening up their border security to stop the flow of illegal migrants into South Africa. In 2010, I did a documentary for Al Jazeera in which I was highlighting the problem of unaccompanied children from Zimbabwe who were literally walking from the border town on the Zimbabwean side called Beitbridge into Musina, the border town on the South African side. Unaccompanied. They just leave home, they walk through the river in the summer season and find themselves in Messina in South Africa looking for food. So that's the first step that the South African government has to take to tighten its borders. Then number 2, it needs to engage in a diplomatic conversation with the source countries of these migrants. For example, they have to have a conversation with Zimbabwe to tighten and police its borders to stop its citizens from walking into South Africa. Then, number 3, the South African government should do the first 2 simultaneously with urgently stopping the mobs of people who are going around the country asking whoever they feel like asking for documents, or whoever they suspect of being a foreigner for documents, and attacking them. I think that has to stop, and it must be stopped immediately. So that calls on the South African government, arms of law, to regain the streets and clean up the streets of elements that are bound on instilling fear or not just migrants, but other citizens. We saw the other day how South African Shanganis were complaining of being attacked because they are suspected of looking like Zimbabweans. We have seen some people from other parts of South Africa, you know, the Basothos from areas around Witbank, who have also been attacked because they are suspected of being South African enough. If South African government does not address this, what will happen after June 30? Let's say all the migrants have been cleaned out of the streets of South Africa, they've gone back to their countries. What will happen next is the scapegoating of one South African by another. So there's a spectre of tribal clash here. There is also an example of one Shangani, or is it Nguni, gentleman who was running a factory in Durban. He's on social media and he has been complaining about how this whole issue is being handled. He had to close his factory and went back, traveled from KwaZulu-Natal and went back to Limpopo for fear of being attacked because they suspect he looks like a foreigner. So this tribal element is very, very dangerous. And I think it is laying eggs for a very dangerous situation that South Africa should be very careful of. And that's why the South African government needs to act now to stop the lawlessness on the streets. Then, number 2 scenario that might happen after June 30. This tribal element is also likely to lead to a situation where certain societal groups will now start saying, we don't want people from this part of the country in our area because they are taking away our jobs. I've given you an example of a Shangan man who had to run away from KwaZulu-Natal because he's suspected of being not from there. So this will not end with the migrants. It is the beginning of a slippery slope that will be very difficult to draw back from when push comes to shove. So it's very, very important to analyze and understand what's happening here. And once one community, let's say the Zulus, say we don't want the Shanganis here, what will stop the Zulus, the Xhosas from saying we don't want the Zulus in Eastern Cape? What will stop the vendors from saying we don't want anyone else who's not from here? Now, when that happens, it would be a warm-up to what some groups have been pushing for. Now, what will stop Western Cape? What will stop the whites from Western Cape from saying we want to secede from South Africa? We have seen it. I've been to Orania, the town in the Karoo in Northern Cape, where only white people live. What will stop that community from saying, in fact, they have already said they don't want anyone else who's not African. What will stop them from saying now, we want to build our own country, our own enclave, white enclave in South Africa? So the pattern of what will morph out of these xenophobic attacks is something that is worrying, and something that the South African government and all those who live in it must be worried, because it will not stop with the migrants. It will continue. And it's even worrying that the xenophobic attacks are now being used as a political potato that can be used by political parties to try and get an edge ahead of the local government elections in November. It's a very dangerous and slippery road that South Africa is traveling on. But having said that, I also want to acknowledge what Jacinda Gonese-Zuma, the leader of the March group, has been saying, that we want to clean. I mean, the argument is we want migrants to go so that we can be able to have a family meeting and look each other in the eye and start sorting our problems without distractions. Okay, fair and fine, a very acceptable argument from a South African point of view, and one that I think lends credence. If you are a South African, what Jacinda has been arguing that we need a Pan-African movement that fights for the rights of Africans. And she argues that without our friends from Zimbabwe, from Malawi, from Nigeria, from Ghana, from Kenya, from Ethiopia, without them taking their government to task, we are not going to have a Pan-African movement that can build everlasting human rights for Africans. There's a lot of sense in that argument, because I think we cannot all be running away from our countries whenever there are problems. It's also important to be able to take our government to task and be able to demand for our rights at home. It's nicer to travel to other countries per choice, not as an act of necessity. I mean, I agree with that point that we need to fight harder against the elites, the political elites that are taking people's livelihoods for granted, the elites who are taking people's rights for granted. There is something there, but I think we cannot go about it by first seeking to empty our countries of all foreigners. I don't think it's the best way of approaching this noble idea. Like I said at the beginning, you can't set a thief to catch a thief. But why I am persuaded to agree with her, if you have groups of migrants coming into a country where the minimum wage, let's say it's set up at 5,000 rand, rand being the South African currency, then you've got an illegal migrant who rocks up at a winemaking farm, and they accept a job for 2,000 rand a month instead of 5,000, the minimum wage. That creates tensions. And of course, the business community in South Africa, it's not a secret. They've been taking advantage of this uncontrolled migration that has been happening in the country, and in the process undermining the labor rights of all workers in South Africa. So it's very important to also look at it from the point of view of South Africans who are complaining about the rising migration in their country. And it's also important to take to task the leaders, the political leaders of the countries from which migrants are coming from. It's really, really important to acknowledge that tension and to acknowledge that from a South African point of view. It's only fair for us to do that, to balance off the arguments here. Having said that, I also want to explore a little bit about the role of the corporate companies in South Africa, apart from, the under-end and the non-unionized working force that they prefer. I think they've been making killing in paying workers below the poverty datum line and also below the minimum wage, agreed minimum wage in South Africa. Previously, we saw these companies also making statements against xenophobic attacks. But this time around, I may be wrong, but I am yet to see statements of solidarity with migrants, despite the fact that they have been working in the homes of business owners in South Africa. They've been working in factories in South Africa. They've been working in companies, in farms in South Africa. So it's now a moment of reckoning for also to really look at the role that the corporates in South Africa have also been contributing to this problem by employing and paying, peanuts in salaries, taking advantage of the illegal migration that has been taking place. I think it's also time to interrogate that and try and help resolve this crisis, because this is where some of the grievances of South Africans are coming from, that laws in their country are not being respected. A lot of corners are being cut. Things are being done ultra vires. So it's from that point of view, I think it's important to acknowledge some of the points that are being made by Jacinda Ngobese, as well as some of the leaders of the March and the protest against migrants. It is only through this acknowledgement that we can be able to start to have a proper analysis and deeper conversation about exactly what is happening in South Africa and understand what has been a long-drawn crisis, and perhaps try to build some long-term solutions, because I think that's what is needed at the moment, even after June 3rd. The likely scenario on Tuesday, we are likely to see more hordes of people marching in the streets of South Africa and attacking any remaining migrants. So I'm hoping those who are there would be safe and would have somewhere to shelter, be it at their consulates or embassies, and hopefully it won't be as deadly as the previous ones. But it's a problem that we need to resolve on a more continental point of view, because I think it's not something that South Africa alone can be able to address. It's a bigger problem, bigger than just one country, one that needs to be solved from a very concerted African effort. The president of Ghana, John Mahama, has suggested an African Union summit to discuss the crisis in South Africa. But I think as part of that, it's also important for African leaders to finally be able to have no-hold-barred discussions around the democratization, the respect for human rights, and really be able to face off with each other and finally put the interest of their people at heart, so that we can be able to give people a chance to survive in their own countries there, but be able to travel, but only as a matter of choice, not necessity. Because as long as we have the current situation where we have leaders who do not have the interests or the welfare of their people at heart, we are likely to continue to see migration patterns to countries that are perceived to be doing well, and these tensions will continue. So we implore leaders who care about their people to finally stand up. And to South Africa, we say thank you. I am from Zimbabwe. Thank you for looking after our people for a very long time. 2008 was not an easy time for Zimbabweans. We know in some cases we have overstayed our welcome, but there are ways. There are ways of going about and solving the inherent problems that we might be having. We have married in each other's families. We now share children. We are neighbors. There are things that we cannot wish away. It's important for us to have a dialogue. We hear you. We hear your grievances. We hear you. Let's try and work together to solve this crisis. And God bless us all.